we are joined by Nathalie. It's Nathalie, and I can say this with the Swedish last name, silent consonant, and Meryl, to talk about something relatively new at Salesforce, about which I've learned a ton because we've had a couple of these conversations, which is content design. So, and you're going to talk about content design itself and building your influence as a content designer. So I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. We're talking about building influence as a content designer because with it being such a new kind of principle here at Salesforce, there's some sort of like, how do you get people to know like who you are and what you do and how that's different from a normal like tech writer? And how do you kind of make sure that you're in the room at the right time with the right people so that you can be effective in your role? And those are just some of the things that we hear a lot from newer content designers. So we wanted to just go through it together, talk through about what are some things that we felt have been really helpful in establishing content design at Salesforce, and kind of how do you go. I think Meryl and I both, we both came from a tech writer background. So kind of how do you go from tech writer and being influential there to being influential in content design?
Yeah. All right, that's awesome. Meryl? I mean, getting a seat at the table, the various tables, is something actually everybody in CX or content experience, we're all talking a lot about that, right? Because making sure that we're involved where we need to be involved. So this is really timely.
I think a couple of ways we feel like are like really key ways of going about that is to like really be clear about how the content design role is different from a CX writer role, and how it really is more of a design job than a writing job. And your stakeholders do make assumptions, especially when they've known you already as a CX writer. They'll make assumptions about what to do, when to involve you, and sometimes they assume you're just writing labels, but you're writing them a little earlier than you did before. And so we've been trying to reset that expectation that this is actually something where we can participate in the conversation and change the outcome of the design.
What are some of the things that let's say a new or existing or content designer needs to do?
Yeah, I feel like when it comes to like being clear about what you do on the team, there's a lot of different ways I think that folks try to establish that. One is like often a presentation that sort of like goes through exactly what Meryl said, which is here's what I do and here's how it's different to what like a tech writer does, and here's how to work with me. There's a lot of those circulating. We're currently working on making a shared one that everyone can kind of just reuse, since we know we've all have the same struggles. So that's one. I think we also recommend that you have regular syncs with your stakeholders. So like that PM sync is going to be really important to establish with them over time, saying like, we need to meet. So I'm going to tell you what we should be doing in these syncs so that you start to learn my function and when to involve me. So a lot of it is like being proactive and setting up those things. You kind of have to be the one to drive those initial conversations and have those regular syncs and touch points so that over time, through practice and repetition, they kind of just know now, like, oh, this is what you do. This is when to involve you. You've made that clear.
I think also we've been talking about being persistent.
Yeah.
Like it's really important when, you ask to be involved and then, someone forgets or they involve you the first time and not the next time, not to feel shy or anything about like reminding them like, hey, invite me to that meeting, or hey, it would be really great if I'm, in all of the UX PM conversations. So just really not feeling shy about that.
Yeah. And I feel like another thing that we talk a lot about is like the difference between showing versus telling. So all of that was kind of like, we're telling you when you should involve us and how we can help you. But often there's an element of like, well, sometimes if we show you on top of all the telling, that's when you start to get it, where you're like, okay, we should add you to this meeting because when you come, you are actually like participating in the meeting and you're bringing up really important points that maybe we got stuck somewhere in a conversation and everyone was like stuck in their way of thinking. And then you kind of like turn the conversation in a different direction. And they're like, that's why you're here. We should invite you to these more often, get you involved early. Or maybe you like mock something up. So showing that you have skill, like visual skills as well, is a good way.
I love that because I worked for I had a boss once that said, be cheerfully persistent, which is, and then demonstrating your value by basically plying your craft, right? Which is,
Yep.
I mean, I can see assuming you come to this from technical writing and everybody just has a mental picture, right?
Yeah, I feel like some of the things that we often hear that we kind of try to keep a lookout for are like, oh, well, Nathalie, I'll add you to this meeting when we're ready to talk labels, right? And those are we have a few like little warning flags that tell us that maybe we haven't done enough at this point to establish how to work with me or what my role is. So we kind of look out for things like we're going to reach out for labels, or I think we also hear a lot of like, oh, well, this isn't a content design project, really. This is more UX led, or this is back end. This is an engineering project. And that also often is like, we do a lot more than just like the front end. And so when we hear those things, that's usually a good indicator for us that we should kind of raise our hand and make sure that we look at what they're saying and reinforce maybe where they may not know why we should be involved, and then possibly as part of the showing, like show what we could do for them in instances when they think that maybe they don't need us.
Yeah,
Right.
I've heard Fiona mention that talk about being involved at the right time, right?
Yep.
Not waiting until you assume, because like you say, it's a relatively new discipline for us.
Yeah, we often get involved, like you think, like with information architecture, which is something that can happen way before there's ever even been a mock. And so during the conversations where PM and UX are like ideating about what are the main things that we're trying to solve, like what are the jobs to be done that we are trying to solve, what are we hearing from our customers, we should be in those meetings. Like we should be in those conversations, because even before you put pen to paper or cursor to Figma, we should be thinking about like how do the things relate to each other, what kind of like interdependencies are there, how does it work across other places, and things like that.
Yeah, and some of those things are established in those really early discussions, even with engineering. And so those things stick. And even when you show up at the end of the beginning, it's a little too late. So it's nice to be in those conversations early, be able to ask questions, especially now too with Agent Force. Like there's, we need to be teaching a AI entity how to interact with our users, because we can no longer just predict what we're saying to them with labels. And so I even find myself kind of reaching out to the conversation designer and saying like, hey, sometimes those agents returning feedback that like isn't kind of fitting our UI. Like, how can we talk to it in a different way so that it's like interacting with our users in a way that's like consistent and they know what to expect when they open this tab or this card or whatever it is.
Oh, I had not even, of course, we're using agents all the time. I hadn't even thought of that aspect of it, right? Because when AI gives you something you're not expecting or something that, that's interesting.
Yeah, you can really hone that prompt to be what you need it to be.
Mm-hmm. And
Very
also
cool.
it introduces a big question mark for us from like a content design perspective of like, if we don't know what it's going to say, we don't always know the best way to treat the rest of the UI to like match the sort of the actions that the agent is trying to give. So the more we're involved even with the prompt, the more we kind of understand what interactions need to happen on the rest of the page so that we can then make sure that that UI meets the engineering things that are going to cause the AI to go one direction or another. Like there's so much interrelatedness that people don't think of.
I have to say, every time I talk to content designers, which, like I say, I've learned a lot. Everything you produce is beautiful. So I think it's elegant and beautiful. I don't know if you have anything you want to show people or if you want to kind of walk through some things, but feel free.
Yeah, we have some examples that we wanted to show as just like different ways you can kind of establish influence or like drive conversations. Let me pull those up. This first one's actually really like basic, or it's not even a very like a design example. It's more like, how do you get yourself in the room? And this can be how, which is working with your TPM and your team with being part of what's called definition of ready. It's really basic, but if we are part of definition of ready, It means that at like a structural level, engineering cannot work on something unless we've been involved and we've signed off on something. And I find this to be like was really helpful for me on some projects that I've been working on, because I always knew I was going to be aware of things. I was going to be in there on time. And so this we found to be like a very good model that we're hoping that more folks can kind of adopt and work with their teams to make sure that they're part of this. In terms of actual other examples, I know Meryl, you had this really good example that you had worked on and to kind of show like what content design can do.
Yeah, this was one of those examples where my team had a lot going on. And so for this one project, they were like, you know what, we don't need a content designer on this. It's okay, UX has it. And so they did this V1 on the left here. And it Natalie, if you hit there you go, thank you. This was like the little panel that they produced. And, at the outset, I even took like a quick look at it and was like, oh, it looks good to me because I had some context about the project. But they showed it to some users and just like very informally showed a couple of customers that the PM had calls with, and they kind of came back with, they used, this is forecasting, and they used forecasting all the time. And so we thought we were giving them like all this helpful additional information. And then they got in there and they were like, I don't know what to do on this panel. And so then the UX designer and the PM sat down with me and they were like, can we talk about this? And so it was kind of nice to have them coming to me, instead of vice versa, where I'm like chasing them a little bit. And so we had like some nice, like really like probably 2-hour meetings that were just really interesting discussions about like how the customers reacted, how I was even reacting once I like really tried to engage with the panel instead of just glancing at it quickly. And we realized that like there were, some things that maybe the team thought was really intuitive that just wasn't. And so we ended up changing a lot of labels, changing a lot of the layout. And then we ended up with that panel on the right side. And, to be honest, it could probably use a few more passes. It has a lot of information on it, but it was definitely something that like, once they showed it to a customer again, now like it had the right terminology, it had comparisons that it hadn't before. So it gave more context. And so the customer was able to see like, oh, I actually see what I'm supposed to be using this for. So that was a nice development. And this is some additional things. It was funny because when we had the conversation with the PM and UX designer, the thought was like, well, let's just fix this panel. But then throughout our discussion, I learned, which I didn't know previously, that there were actually like 2 different workflows where somebody might engage with this thing, and they would engage with it for different reasons. They would use different parts of the panel at different parts of the sales process. And so we realized like we actually wanted to have kind of a guided experience for both of those. And so we created these 2 prompts in each of the flows that were meant to be like kind of temporary information, like kind of just helping them discover the feature. But then also in the first flow, we realized there was some information that actually we wanted to be more static. So we also created 2 different empty states depending on the scenario. And then, as soon as the customer serves whatever step they need to, whatever, when they need to do something, they do what's described on the screen, and then the empty state goes away and they never have to see it again. But if they ever end up back in that situation, there's that static information for them to see. And so none of those details were in the product at all previously. So it was, it was important having that conversation with them to learn, actually we should be telling them all of these things. That's why they're struggling to engage with this feature.
I talk about a use case, right? Getting you all involved in an area where people may be stalling out. That's powerful.
Yeah. It's a good example of like often they kind of, there are teams that are good about like they've worked with you before and they know to bring you in, and then there are teams that it takes bad user feedback where they're like, oh, who do we need to go to because we're seeing this problem? And that's kind of can be a moment where we can show, like, here's what we can do for you, and hopefully you learn from this so that next time I'm involved from the beginning.
It was definitely a big showing versus telling moment, especially because, I joined the team and I spent like a month and a half working with them and told them what I did like 100 times and threw out some ideas. And, like then once they could actually see like where we could go from A to B in the UI, I think it was a different story. Like, oh, no, we needed to do that.
Yeah, there was also this example um, of some stuff I've been working on with Go that I feel like has been a good example of when you are given the space of like, we know what content design can do, and we will give you the space to own things and show what you can do for us. Um, so I've been working on Sales Cloud Go, but also, or Salesforce Go, and then also like the Service Cloud side of that, where we realized when we were sort of going through it that most of it's actually kind of an information architecture project, because there's this framework UI that everyone is supposed to sort of adopt, and we have been working on how do we like teach people how to use the framework. But once the framework UI is kind of done, it's more about how do you consume an established pattern and figure out how things fit together and group them and like things like that. So with my team, we kind of discovered that this could be something that's more content design led. So there was a lot of conversations with like PM and UX and with me where we needed to just define swim lanes so that there was no confusion of like, well, who does what? This is kind of a different type of project. So PM sort of said like, okay, they're going to own PRDs, but Nathalie, you're going to be involved in writing the PRDs as well because of the way that this project is so tied with information architecture. So there was like a collaboration there. And then UX and I decided like, because there wasn't much for them here, it was more they would review what I did, and then they would provide their feedback. And then if there were any framework gaps that we were discovering as I was building these pages where we're like, that's not working so well, I think there's a problem in the Go framework, would be a moment where I'd be like, that's a UX problem. So let's come together, let's talk about it, and you'll probably, the UX driver will drive, or the UX person will drive it. So this was a great kind of example of being able to actually, we each kind of chose our swim lane, and then we went off, did our own thing, come together, kind of the diamond, the double diamond here, like being able to work together and establish what we each could bring to the table. This is another one that it was like a similar situation, I think, to Meryl, where you're like new to our team, you're trying to figure out how do you teach them what you do and how can you be most effective for them? Like, how do you do that? And interestingly enough, like of all the things on this page, the thing that I found to be the most impactful on this page was that I was the owner of what's the point of this page? What's the guiding principle of this page? And so that was sometimes just like being in the room, and they would be like, okay, the goal of this page is that by the end, and we came up with this after like talking to our partners, implementation partners, and really talking to our stakeholders and trying to figure out like, what's the problem we're trying to solve and why do we care about this problem? And we landed on, we need people to be able to set up a service appointment. This is for field service. We need them to be able to set up a service appointment, because if they can't set up a service appointment, they cannot see value at all from this entire product. Like they're never going to be able to like use anything else. And so this product is just like dead in the water. And that was like a good guiding principle, so that every time people were like, can we add this other thing to the page, or can we do this, or can we do that? And you'd be like, but does it help you create a service appointment? If it doesn't, it shouldn't be here. Exactly. Like, let's just keep it here. Let's keep it targeted, pointed. Everyone knows why they're on this page. There's a clear outcome, and the page is then more useful, right? Like to a user. And I think like my narrow focus on that really helped establish what, like with a new team, how to work with me. I'm like, what can I do? And I'm like, I will keep you on track. We will make sure that we are getting somewhere.
Okay, that also, I think, profound. I think I'm sensing the good background of an excellent tech writer, because you're focused on the why. Why am I here? What is it doing for me? And I, as somebody who lards up things myself with extraneous information, that's a great reminder to all of us. Stick to what it is and what it does for you.
Yeah, especially in Salesforce with setup pages. Those setup pages get bloated so quickly that if we can't build the first version in a way that's targeted, like we're not looking good for the future iterations.
I think it's a tough question for like product management too, to ask the question of like, what's at the top of the page, set up the basics, because they want you to take full advantage of it all. And
Mhm.
so even though we call that page that, I've worked with a couple of teams who, really wanted like, oh, but there's this part of the feature and this part. And I mean, why even bother setting it up unless you add blah, blah, blah. And I remember Nathalie telling me about this example, and it became my show also, where I would say, when I was trying to make a point, like, I think we need to, pull back on our like our guiding principle for our feature, and nobody would agree with me, I would say, let me tell you a story about field service. And it was very helpful. Especially because it's such a tangible use case, so I thought that was really helpful too. So thank you, Nathalie.
Oh, my pleasure, Meryl. And I feel like what you're saying also reminds me that like a lot of the time there's moments, right, where you feel really strongly about something, and then your stakeholders might be sort of like, well, no, we think it should be this way. And then you're like, well, how do we work around that, right? Like I've got my opinion, you've got your opinion. How do we find consensus and make sure that like your voice is heard, but maybe in the end, it's okay if you don't win every argument, right? Like
Yep.
it's not a winning situation. No one's losing and no one's winning.
Right.
But like in your example, Meryl, it kind of feels like there's times where you can do like anecdotal evidence, right? Like I saying that my story of field service helped maybe like go in a certain direction. But I know other times it can be like data points. You can do research. You can bring mocks that you did to kind of like drive a conversation. I feel like there's a lot of different ways, but uh, it happens where there are tough conversations with stakeholders where you might have different opinions on what to do.
And I think it's like important that sometimes we know when to let those go. We don't want to become like, and we don't want to be argumentative, I guess. It's like, just because I feel strongly about it doesn't mean I'm right. And so I threw my opinion out there. I brought my show, and if it didn't push the needle, then let's let this go. And if it comes up later, we can say like, hey, I could bring it up a second time and act like it was the first time, and maybe people are in a better position to hear me. And I think also, sometimes, we're not the decision makers, the product managers are the decision makers. And so all you can do is like put it out there. Sometimes it's nice to put it out there in writing so that like if things come back, you could say like, well, we talked about it right
I warned you.
here. And yeah, not so much and I told you so, but also like we considered it, and here's where we all landed as a team.
Yeah, I often find like you can do also like sort of like a risk assessment where you can say, okay, if we go with what you're suggesting, let's all be clear about here's the things that are going to happen as a result. Are we okay with that, right? Like, is that risk worth it to us? Are we all on the same page that if we do it, with where we add a ton of stuff to the page and it becomes bloated, users may not finish everything on the page? Are we okay with that? And I feel like that helps us sort of determine when is it worth like continuing to advocate and fight, because as long as you've made it very clear what the ramifications are and we're all like in agreement on, okay, that we accept this is what it is, it's easier to be like, okay, I was heard and we can move on.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point for interacting with teams, right? And I say this as somebody who's often guilty of using expansive prose when I need to be pared back. So, but it helps when I show it to, I show it to my colleagues and say, it's a little much there. So you allude to kind of you've got a lot of arrows in the quiver, right? Of ways that you can make a case. One of the I think you mentioned research.
Yep.
And yeah.
Yeah, we'll often lead our own research or work with research. I know Colleen and Francis, I think, have talked about research and the role that we can have there. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of different ways that we can plug in where I know if I feel strongly about something, I will run my own research on it to make sure that that's like an argument I can use in a discussion with a PM. If like that can be like, well, I really think it needs to be this. And I ran this user study that shows that this does well with users. So, okay, here we are. What do we think?
I think also, if you're feeling like too busy or overwhelmed by the idea of running your own research, you could also like use any opportunity you see to hop on the research of your team. Like, for example, in the case where, in the example I was giving where my PM and my UX designer brought something to the customer, I wasn't involved. But the second time I told them, like, oh, hey, see how they respond to this term. Could you ask them about it? Could you ask them if they understand, what's happening in this section below this header, and just kind of have them be your proxy. And even getting, you don't have to run like 100-person, project. You can always just get some anecdotal responses, and it's better than nothing in a pinch.
We also have good resources from the research and insights team often already available. Like if they've done work on personas, that can often help us if we're arguing for like, well, that information isn't relevant here. Well, we have information about personas, right? And that can help drive like, well, if this is the wrong persona, then this is the wrong information. So there's a lot of existing stuff that we can leverage.
Yeah, this is awesome. This is all awesome. I mean, I think you talked about the research discussion we've already had, and if I were new or coming into this group, I'd want to watch all 3 of these videos because I think you guys are awesome.
I think this is actually kind of a lot of it. We often we just wanted to kind of talk about like feeling how to establish yourself within your teams, how to get your voice heard, like what tools do you have in your tool belt, right? Of like, I think there's some that we've talked about or alluded to is around like creating mocks. I know that maybe if you're newer to content design, you may not be super, super comfortable yet in Figma. We do encourage you though to like grow those skills if you can. And FigJam is a good place to start if you're not super comfortable in Figma, it's a little bit more lightweight. Like it's more of a fun tool where you can do more like wireframes. And that can also be really effective when you're thinking about like, how do you share your ideas in a way that's compelling so that you get more people on your side. Visuals are often so key, but wireframes or like more low res, low fidelity can be really useful.
Yeah, I think the showing versus telling advice is incredibly important in a lot of disciplines, but yours especially.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've tried to describe. It's a hard role to describe, right? Like we design with words is one way I've heard it described, which sounds lovely, but what does that truly mean, right? Like what does designing with words mean? And until you really show like a before and after, or you show like this is kind of where we started and here's like talking out loud, I'll often present to my UX partners and I'll say like, here's my thought process and here's how I went from this to this. And they're like, oh, we get it now.
Mm-hmm. It is a different thought process, I think.
Man, you two are awesome.
Thanks, Dan.
No, I mean, it's like eye-opening because it's really great. It's really, and you make this is really compelling information for somebody on how to get that seat at the table, as you say, and get people to the next time to put you into the process at the right time, right? Which is one of your goals.
Yeah, we often just heard from folks that are like new to content design, especially if they came from a tech writing role, that there was maybe a little bit of like imposter syndrome where they didn't really know. Maybe I think as a tech writer, you're more used to letting PM just like PM says it, so that's what it is. And this is a different function. It's not always PM says it, so that's what it is. And so there was some of this is hoping to help people realize what tools do they have. It's okay to speak up and push back and share your opinion in a way that doesn't always feel as accessible, I think, as a tech writer, where you are more of a decision maker now. Like you are like at the table deciding what the ultimate product is going to look like. So it's a little bit of a different hat if it's something that's new to you.
That's incredible. I mean, you think about it, millions and millions and millions of users are going to that page without anybody standing over their shoulder, telling them how to get something done, and it has to speak for itself, right?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
No one's saying, oh, well, we have this complication with the architecture, so we had to do it you don't get excuses. You get one chance to make a point.
Profound information right there. So anything we didn't cover?
I was thinking one thing we alluded to, but we didn't really hit on was that, if you are feeling intimidated, or if, you aren't feeling sure of yourself, to like just show up as an active
Yeah.
listener. I mean, you gain so much by being at the conversation at the beginning. And, sometimes I show up on a new project and it's like 3 or 4 meetings in before I have anything of value to say. But I have gained so much in learning about the perspectives and the personas, things that like people share documentation or slide decks on, but like really hearing people like talk it out and push on concepts, in a conversation, you just get a lot from that. So, yeah, I do think sometimes I start out a project thinking one thing, and a couple of meetings later, I'm kind of like, you know what? I'm in a different place now. I understand why we're going this direction, and I'm on board,
Yeah.
So it's not only about like sharing the things you're passionate about and challenging things, but also like trying
Listen.
to really listen and understand where your team is coming from.
Yeah, and we didn't really talk about this before, Meryl, but there's also like an element of, we've talked about how do you like advocate for yourself, but it's also like how do you do it tactfully, in a way that doesn't offend people. That can be challenging, especially in our role, because like the line between UX and content design can be blurred, and there's so much collaboration that I feel like until you have a really good working relationship with them, I often approach them very differently. Where I
Yeah,
come to them, instead of being like, well, here's your design and here's why I don't like it and here's what we should do instead, right? Like no one's going to respond well to that. Like there's
right.
a way that you do it.
Right. And like coming in, like if you've got 10 things to say and they're all negative, like pick your top 3 maybe,
Yeah.
and, save the other ones for later and see where things land, because you don't want to come in as, just like challenge. Yeah. Like a critic, like challenging everything someone's working on,
Yeah. I often have
So,
them run through it first and ask, I basically will like, can you walk me through the process here? Like how you came up with this? Because I remember there was one time where I was like, what, this is so weird. I know this designer wouldn't normally put out something like this. So I had all of these ideas of like ways to improve it. And then when she walked me through it, it was very clear that it was like, oh, this was actually because of an engineering thing and this she was forced into it. And if I had come in like, guns blazing, being like, oh, well, why did you do this? And you should do this instead. That would have been a really challenging working relationship where it's like, well, you're just not on my side. And I don't know if I just want to get critiqued by you.
yeah.
You should do a separate discussion on the soft skills that you're talking about, because that's really important. And we've all made mistakes on that front where we go in. I dealt with a writer once, and I said, I finally said, I have to meet with you because I cannot understand why this is so confusing. And she laid everything out to me, and it was a bunch of engineering problems that we had to write around. She had to write around. So, humbling experience.
Right. Yeah. So we can be disconnected from it sometimes, and you're like, I'm so convinced I'm right. And you're like, have an open mind about it.